My name is Ayodele Ige. I'm a PhD student from the University of Glasgow. I'm in my year 2. And I'm working on the contestation between Western medicine and Yoruba medicine in colonial Nigeria. So I'm happy to be here this afternoon to interact with you. So I've come up with a title to this discussion: Hidden Voices of African History Through Digitized Primary Sources. Researchers more than before can now access historical documents without having to cross borders. This is as a result of existing digital archives that make materials and resources available to them right in their private spaces. For example, the Adamati Online Digital Archive has a collection of Christian missionary records, specifically the activities of the Christian Missionary Society in European colonies across the globe, which can be accessed right from anywhere in the world. To this end, I'm profoundly grateful to the management of Adamati for granting me a year of access to this document, and I have found them very relevant to my narrative. The digital missionary records provide detailed information on various missionaries' interventions in colonial Yoruba society, specifically revealing their footprint during the major episodes in European colonies during the 19th and 20th centuries. In these collections, one could see how Christian missionaries used education and medicine as tools of evangelization, cultural imperialism, and to an extent, political control. Some of the records I have access to at the Adamati Ige archive, such as journals, memoirs, Mercy and Truth, later renamed Mission Hospital, and a few others, demonstrate that medical evangelism was a deliberate strategy to convert many people who were considered pagans in Yoruba land. They established dispensaries and attempted to build hospitals, which were unsuccessful. Given the ratio of the doctors to the teeming population, it is not enough to consider their activities as an alternative to Yoruba medicine. Furthermore, we can see that most CMS hospitals in West Africa were unstructured and lacked the necessary facilities to thrive. For example, due to the drug shortage in 1922, Ige Hospital, the only missionary hospital in eastern Nigeria, was forced to close for several months. Given the CMS massive medical interventions in Nokchon and Sri Lanka in Asia during this period, one should ask why the same level of interventions was not carried out in Nigeria. Meanwhile, several sources indicate that Africans were receptive to missionary activities, including the medical interventions. According to Ondo Province Collection, archival document at the National Archives Ibadan, it is revealed that chiefs and people provided lands and cash to support the missionaries in the establishment of dispensaries in their community. Other clear manifestations in these collections are agendas served by missionaries in medicine. Aside from healing frail and ill African bodies, for example, if you look at Mercy and Truth and Mission Hospital, you will see the idea of medical evangelism and the whole agenda of missionary medicine. It is more apparent in these records that missionaries acted as anthropologists, popularizing science, medical culture, and idea found in specific African society and providing vital information on ethnomedicine. We have a wealth of experience from Wellcome collections, UK archives, and the Royal Botanical Gardens on how missionaries acted as anthropologists by facilitating material medical transfer. Missionaries were invariably writing and publishing a series of annals that were extremely valuable to transatlantic knowledge exchanges. In her interesting work, Bitterroot, Abena wrote an entire book from some of the records she collected from UK archives. However, what is not obvious from these records is whether Africans were also using Western ideas to authenticate age-long healing practices. Predictably, One would not expect this in missionary records because of the humanitarian agenda Christian missionaries sought in African society. Given the foregoing, therefore, my agenda for a couple of months now is to discover voices and agendas that are not obvious in digital archives. I tend to agree with colleagues that believe that the process of digitalizing the archive goes beyond bringing historical sources under technological lenses. I hope future research can reveal in detail discussions, negotiations behind the digitalization process. The question that bothers my mind is whether these discussions influence the exclusion of certain voices while overemphasized certain perspectives. For instance, in all these histories, beyond the listing of certain herbs and their medical values and the interests of the missionaries, the sources could be useful to an African historian that want to amplify African voices in history. Africans are uncomfortably docile in subservient conditions as they are encountered by missionaries along the walkway of history. That is, the interaction between them, according to the document I read, most of the missionaries interacted with the healers in the process. They were not fully interested. They were just, oh, how are you preparing your healing substance? So they were not interested. It's a walkway of history. They interacted. I call it accidental interaction between the missionaries and the Yoruba healers. I do not have a plethora of records that provide insight into the agenda served by these specific African actors. In Western medicine, for instance, we know the agenda served by missionaries and professionals within the institution of local medicine, but we do not know the kind of Africans who play key roles in colonial medical practice. We know that some African medical auxiliaries who play important roles in the missionary system were trained in the 1920s, but we do not have a record of their activities after they were trained. This explained why there were few sources on them, despite the fact that there were a number of African midwives and nurses that carry out and dispense a hybrid of Western and African medicine in the 1920s. Shobala Shankar, Alimati Kalusa, and others, for example, mention how Africans read alternative meanings into colonial medical discourses. I cannot find the sources that produce these interesting histories in these digital collections. To reveal the marginalized voices, we cannot write a comprehensive history of Africa without carrying out an intentional unraveling of oral traditions or oral histories because of the dynamism of our society and the politics of archival documentation. Archives are product of historical processes that were compiled through official means. With respect to the colonial archive, we do not expect the colonialists to present records that will put them at the base of cultural exchange. Instead, as social Darwinists, they converse with everyone within the state based on the mode of power relation of that time. They were colonialists, and so they would not be saying that African midwives who were not trained had a mind to improvise in a rural community. That is not triumphalism and will not really justify the colonial enterprise in Africa. In the history of medical pluralism in African society, no one who intermixed Western medicine and African medicine did it officially. And there are few or no sources where African midwives claim they care for a patient by using herbs. However, this does not mean that things that are not written or documented do not exist, especially in Africa. As an African, I'm aware of many things that do not necessarily exist on paper. This was largely due to a lack of expansive documentation made possible by Europeans. We get to know about certain events by reading personal histories and memoirs, and by listening to and documenting their personal histories of those actors. My PhD thesis requires me to research some of these characters, actors, and find a way to bring their histories into the limelight. I believe your job as archivists is to rely on the intelligence that some of us as Africans can provide to find the actual names of some of these figures who play key roles throughout African history and try to hear people's imagination, knowledge of these people, even if they are no longer alive. No doubt, this project is an intentional process that will be capital intensive, because the biggest limitation you find in this period is that you can only do that for a very contemporaneous event or periods. How can you do that for pre-colonial periods? It is quite a difficult task to do because some of the names were not recorded in the first instance. When we look at the politics of memorialization or commemoration, it is an interesting part of history, especially when we discuss within the colonial context or colonial Southern Africa, where the colonialists were very intentional about demystifying African legend because of a symbolic representation they had in African society, and how those representations could obstruct the colonial project. Several studies have shown how colonialists became interested in burial tradition, for instance, and how this interest suggests to us that colonialism was an enterprise that was very intentional about silencing African agencies. What this suggests is that we cannot use a colonial framework to reconstruct the history of African society. When we talk of decolonizing the archives, we simply mean that we cannot use colonial archives to write the history of Africans across time. What we need to do is go beyond the sources reposed in the archives. If colonialists were intentional about demystifying African legend and ancestors, what would we say about the period prior to the 19th century, when Africans themselves were not as literate as would have been expected? How traditions were obstructed as a result of social disruptions. 100 years war, for instance, in the Yoruba land, in the case of Agoja, Ikoyi, and some other communities, to name a few, they are already gone into oblivion. How do we unearth this history? This means that certain histories are disappeared due to the disappearance of certain pre-colonial society. It is a problem that even I cannot solve. How do we find it? This is a question we must ask and continue to consider in relation to enterprise archiving and documenting. I believe there is a need to digitize oral traditions, which can greatly assist us in finding solutions to certain problems. For example, if we turn oral tradition from the 16th century, we can learn about details that are not always available in the archives. My work focuses on the 19th and 20th century, and I noticed that certain African actors were not present. To accommodate these hidden voices, I attempted to broaden the scope of my work. As previously stated, we do not know the role of African medical auxiliaries in colonial medical practice. The closest thing we have are fictional works like Amitav Ghosh, Kakuta chromosome. We do not know what role certain African scientists played in the development of tropical medicine. It is obvious they were not the real actors because the tropical medicine, as a subdiscipline of medicine, did not originate in Africa. And it was a discipline that already chosen its theorists and professionals, thereby purposefully excluding some people. How can you tell the story of Africans in these crafts when the institution has excluded Africans from its enterprise? It's a question for us. What we can do is to intentionally seek out the stories of these African actors. We must ask questions from people who are in some way related to these people in order to unearth their histories, learn about them, and try as much as possible to include them in our narratives. But the only way we can do so is if the archive make concerted efforts to find the private files of those Africans, either from relatives or from government offices and capacities where they functioned during their lifetime. It is only when we do that that we can then start asking very important questions about their inclusion in the archival documentation. Thank you very much.